Story 1. I should have turned the projector off immediately, but I didn't. And that's why I know what was recorded on that reel. The projector hummed in the darkness. The wind outside pushed against the wooden walls, and I was the only person in the building. At the time, I was working in a small, isolated town, far in the north, where winter nights felt endless. The only form of entertainment people had was a small movie hall that barely deserved to be called a theater. The building was old wood, the heater worked when it wanted to, and the films arrived in dusty boxes that traveled from town to town after bigger cinemas threw them away. My job was simple. Once a week I received those boxes, checked the reels, and projected whatever movie still worked. Most of them were terrible science fiction films or old monster movies that people watched only because there was nothing else to do during long freezing nights. One evening, after closing, I stayed alone inside the projection room, going through a new shipment of reels that had arrived earlier that day. Most of them were exactly what I expected. Old movies, scratched documentaries, damaged reels that probably would never run properly again. Then I noticed a metal film can without any label that was unusual but not impossible. Stickers often peeled off old containers. What caught my attention was the weight. It felt heavier than a normal reel, and the film inside seemed wound, unusually tight. I remember standing there for a moment, looking at that container and thinking that someone, somewhere, had once cared enough about whatever was inside to preserve it carefully. Curiosity 1. The hall was empty, the wind outside was pushing against the wooden walls, and there was nobody there to tell me not to watch it. I loaded the reel into the projector, dimmed the lights, and started the machine. For a few seconds, the screen stayed black. Then the image appeared slowly through the flicker of the projector light. The footage looked old and grainy, like something recorded decades earlier. A clearing in the woods appeared on screen, illuminated by several torches placed in a rough circle around a large tree. At first, nothing moved, and I thought perhaps the reel had been damaged or the camera had been left running by accident. Then, a man stepped into the frame. He was naked, except for something covering his head. The mask looked handmade, carved from wood or bark, and shaped into a strange helmet that completely hid his face. Sheath, thin branches extended from the back of it like a twisted crown. The man walked slowly around the tree, holding a container in one hand, and as he circled the trunk, he poured liquid over the bark, letting it run down toward the roots. The movement looked deliberate and ceremonial, like part of some ritual that had been performed many times before. At that moment, I still believed I was watching some bizarre art project or student film recorded in the woods. Then the scene jumped forward and several more figures walked into view. They were dressed exactly the same way, wearing those carved masks and nothing else. Between them, they guided another man toward the tree. The difference was obvious immediately. This man had no mask, and he could barely stand. His body moved with the loose, unbalanced sway of someone who had been drugged or heavily intoxicated. The masked figures held his arms and pushed him closer to the trunk before turning him around and pulling his wrists behind the tree. One of them began tying rope around his arms, securing him to the bark while the others watched. The man struggled weakly, but there was almost no strength in his movements. The camera never moved while they worked. When they finished tying him, they stepped back and knelt in a line facing the tree, while another figure remained, standing directly in front of the captive. The footage jumped again. Now the man tied to the tree was moving more violently, pulling at the rope as if he had finally understood what was happening. The masked figure in front of him raised his arm and struck him across the face. Then again. The blows forced the captive's body sideways against the ropes. After several strikes, the man's head dropped forward and his body sagged. For a moment, I thought he had lost consciousness. Then the attacker stepped slightly aside, and the light from the torches revealed something that made my stomach twist instantly. The man tied to the tree had been mutilated, and the dark liquid running down the trunk behind him was unmistakable, even through the grainy film. The masked figures closest to the camera suddenly raised their arms toward the sky, moving with frantic excitement, while the man in front of the tree stepped closer to the body again. That was the moment I shut the projector off. The screen went black, and the sudden silence inside the theater felt heavier than the sound of the machine had been. I sat there, staring at the blank wall, trying to convince myself that the footage had to be fake. Some kind of horror film, some staged performance. But deep down I already knew that what I had seen did not look like acting. The movements were wrong. The reactions were wrong. Everything about that footage felt real in the worst possible way. The next morning I brought the reel to the local authorities, and they watched the film themselves in the same projection room. When the final scene appeared, the room went silent, in exactly the same way it had the night before. The investigation that followed stretched for years. The film stock itself was decades old, and the type of tree visible in the clearing grew in several regions across the north, which made locating the exact place almost impossible. The store that had sold the box of reels had no record of who had originally brought them in, because old film collections were often dropped off anonymously. The trail ended before it even began. Time passed, and eventually life moved on. I left that town and found other work in other places, but the memory of that footage never completely disappeared. Then years later, another box of film reels arrived at the same theater from a different supplier, and inside that shipment was another metal container without any label. I knew immediately that something was wrong. The same weight, the same tight winding of the film. Against my better judgment, I loaded it into the projector and started the machine. The image flickered to life, showing the same clearing in the woods and the same circle of torches. But this time, the masked figures stood around, a massive structure made from branches and sticks towering over the ground like some enormous wooden shelter. One of the figures stepped inside, holding a torch, and seconds later, flames began spreading through the dry wood. The others followed him one by one, disappearing into the burning structure, while the fire climbed higher and brighter. Even through the rising flames, I could see their silhouettes standing perfectly still inside as the structure collapsed around them. None of them tried to escape. The film ended there. No one was ever identified. No location was ever confirmed. And the people responsible for those recordings were never found. But every once in a while, I still wonder how many more reels like that might still exist, sitting forgotten in dusty boxes somewhere, waiting for someone curious enough to load them into a projector and press play. Story 2. The horn woke me before I understood what the sound was. It was not a quick, impatient tap, like someone trying to get another driver to move. It was one long, violent blast that tore through the middle of the night and dragged me out of sleep so suddenly that for a moment I did not even know where I was. The room was completely dark, and the only light came from the weak yellow glow of a street lamp leaking through the curtains. My dog Flint lifted his head from the floor beside the bed and stared toward the window with that rigid stillness animals have when they hear something wrong before people do. Then the horn sounded again louder, this time continuous, aggressive, like someone's hand had fallen onto it and could not lift back off. I sat up slowly and listened. The street outside my building was always dead at that hour. No traffic, no voices, no movement, just darkness and the sound of that horn. Flint stood now, ears raised, body tense, staring toward the glass as if something outside had his full attention. I got out of bed and crossed the room, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the street below. A dark sedan sat crooked across the road with its headlights still on. The driver's door was hanging open, and the horn kept blaring, throwing that same awful sound against the empty buildings around it. I could not see anyone in the seat. I could not see anyone in the street. It looked wrong in a way that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with instinct. My phone started vibrating on the dresser behind me. I turned and saw the name on the screen. Celeste. The same woman who had called earlier that night to warn me that whatever was happening outside was spreading faster than anyone expected. I answered immediately. Her voice came through the speaker in a whisper, and the first thing she asked was if I could hear the horn. I told her I was looking at the car right now. She told me not to go outside, no matter what I thought I saw. The horn finally stopped, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the noise had been. I kept looking through the slit in the curtain. The headlights were still cutting across the street, and the driver's door was still open. I asked Celeste if she knew what had happened, but she did not answer right away. Instead, she told me to stay back from the windows and listen. I stepped away from the glass, but not far. For a moment, nothing moved outside. Then a shape appeared in the street behind the car. Someone was walking slowly toward it from the far end of the block. The figure moved with an unnatural rhythm, one leg dragging slightly behind the other. Flint began growling low in his throat. The person reached the sedan and leaned into the open driver's door. For a second, I thought they were checking on someone inside. Then the figure straightened and looked directly toward my building. Even from that distance, I could tell something was wrong with the way it stood. Its shoulders were stiff and its head tilted slightly to one side like it was listening for something far away. Celeste asked me if anyone had come into view yet, and I told her one of them had reached the car. Her breathing slowed through the phone, and she said the infected moved toward noise. First horns, alarms, shouts. Anything sharp enough to cut through the silence and draw people out with curiosity. Before I could answer, another shape stepped into the glow of the headlights behind the first one, then another. 3 of them now stood around the sedan, all of them staring toward the building, where Flint and I stood in the dark. The horn suddenly began again, louder than before. One of them had leaned through the open window and pressed both hands down on the steering wheel. The blast filled the street, and Flint barked sharply, backing away from the window. I pulled the curtain closed and stepped back. Celeste whispered that meant they knew someone was still nearby. They used noise like bait, not because they understood it the way we did, but because it worked. It made people come to doors. It made curtains move. It made nervous neighbors step outside to see what was wrong. I asked her what would happen if someone did. She did not answer directly. Instead, she told me to stop watching the street and listen to the hallway. I held my breath and focused on the wall near the apartment entrance. At first, I heard nothing. Then footsteps began moving slowly up the stairwell. On the other side, not one person, several. Their steps were uneven, dragging, interrupted by the occasional thud of someone brushing against the rail. Flint retreated from the entrance and pressed himself against my leg, growling harder now. The horn outside kept screaming through the night. Celeste said they were moving through the building floor by floor, following the sound, and any movement they sensed once they got inside. Anyone who opened a door would become the next thing that made noise. I grabbed the backpack I had dropped earlier and checked the zipper with hands that were no longer steady. The footsteps in the stairwell grew louder, almost at my floor now. Flint's growl changed into that low, constant warning he only made when something was too close. The hallway outside went silent for a few seconds. Then a hand struck the wood on the other side of my door. Not a knock, not a call for help, just a slow testing pressure, followed by fingers dragging across the surface, as if the thing outside was trying to understand how the door worked. The horn outside stopped again. The sudden quiet made the next sound worse. The handle on my apartment door moved slightly. Someone was trying to turn it. I stood frozen, staring at the latch while Flint stayed perfectly still beside me. The handle stopped moving. Then the footsteps drifted farther down the hallway toward the next apartment. For a moment, I thought they had moved on. Then something slammed violently against a door farther down the corridor, followed by a short scream that ended almost immediately. Flint flinched and pressed against my leg. Celeste whispered that the noise outside had done exactly what it was meant to do. It brought them here. As if the street itself had heard her, the horn began blaring again, even louder, desperate, sustained, echoing through the entire block. I looked toward the door again. The scratching had started once more. Slower this time, more deliberate, like something was learning how to open a door from the other side. Celeste's voice suddenly cut out. The line went dead. I stood there in the darkness, with Flint pressed against my leg, listening to the handle turn slowly one more time, and somewhere in the distance, another horn began to scream. Story 3. If I had followed that whisper all the way into the trees that night, I would not be here telling this story now. That is the part I am sure about. The part I still cannot explain is what exactly called my name in the first place. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night without knowing why. The room was dark and silent, and for a moment I stayed still, listening the way people do when they wake up, with the feeling that something in the house is not quite right. Outside my window, the street lamp threw a dull yellow glow through the curtains, and everything inside the room looked normal. Then I heard it again. My name. Not loud, not shouted, just a whisper that sounded like it had come from somewhere near the window. I sat up slowly and looked toward the door, expecting to see someone standing in the hallway, but the door was closed and the rest of the house remained completely quiet. I told myself it must have been the tail end of a dream and leaned back against the pillow. That was when my phone began vibrating on the table beside the bed. The light from the screen cut through the darkness, and I saw the name of an old friend calling me. I answered, and he immediately began talking about a late-night drive. A few people were planning outside town. He said they were already gathering, and that if I wanted to come, they could pick me up along the road in a few minutes. I remember holding the phone to my ear while looking toward the window again. Part of me wanted to go because I had not seen those friends in weeks. But something about the way I had woken up kept bothering me. I told him I would think about it and call back. When the call ended, the house fell silent again. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at the curtain while the quiet stretched out around me. Then the whisper came again. This time, it sounded closer. Not outside the door, not in the hallway, right behind the glass of the window. It said my name again. I stood slowly and walked toward the curtain, telling myself that if someone was outside playing a joke, I would see them immediately. When I pulled the fabric aside, the street below was empty. No cars, no people. Just the dim light and the long shadows from the trees along the sidewalk. I stood there for several seconds listening, but nothing else happened. I turned away from the window, and that was when the whisper came again. This time, it was behind me, inside the room. I spun around so quickly. The chair beside the desk tipped slightly, but there was no one there. The door was still closed. The hallway beyond it, silent. The sound faded, like breath disappearing into cold air. My phone vibrated again on the table. The same friend calling back, asking if I had decided yet. I answered and told him I was still thinking about it. He laughed and said, I always overthought things. While he talked, I heard the whisper again. It said my name a third time. My friend kept speaking through the phone, but I barely listened now. Every instinct in my body was telling me something was wrong. I told him I would call later and ended the conversation. The silence inside the house no longer felt normal. It felt heavy, like the air inside a room right before a storm breaks. I walked slowly across the floor toward the door and opened it, checking the hallway, but nothing moved in the darkness beyond. When I stepped back inside the room, the whisper came again right beside my ear. I actually felt the air move against my skin, as if someone had leaned close enough to breathe on me. That was the moment I decided to step outside for a minute, just to clear my head. The night air felt colder than I expected when I opened the door and walked down the short path beside the house. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the trees around the property swayed gently in the wind. I stood there, breathing slowly, telling myself I had only imagined the voice. Then it came again. This time from the tree line behind the yard. It said my name once more. The sound was faint, but clear enough that I knew exactly where it had come from. Something in the darkness between the trees had called me. Against my better judgment, I took a few steps toward the edge of the yard, trying to see if someone was standing there. For a moment, I thought I saw movement in the grass. I stepped closer. The whisper came again. Right before something struck my leg, the pain hit instantly sharp and burning, and I looked down just in time to see a thick snake coiled around my ankle before it slid back into the brush. Panic hit me harder than the pain. I stumbled backward toward the house, grabbing the doorframe, while my heart hammered in my chest. The venom spread through my leg like fire, and I forced myself to remember what little I knew about snake bites while tying a belt tight above the wound. I managed to reach the road, where a passing driver eventually stopped and helped me reach the nearest hospital. The doctors told me later the snake had been extremely venomous, and if I had waited much longer, the poison might have reached my heart. They asked why I had been walking in the dark near the trees in the middle of the night. I told them the truth, that something had called my name from the woods. The doctor looked at me for a long moment before writing something in my chart and saying I was lucky because the bite had missed a major artery by less than an inch. 3 days later, after I was released, I returned to the place behind my house where the snake had struck me. The grass was still flattened where I had fallen, and the dirt showed clear marks from where I had stumbled backward. But there were no snake tracks anywhere in the soil. Instead, there were footprints, human footprints leading from the tree line to the exact spot where I had been standing when the whisper called my name. My friend told me something else later about that same night. He said the car carrying everyone to the late-night drive lost control on the road outside town and crashed hard enough to send 2 people to the hospital. If I had gone with them, I would have been in that car, so whatever called my name that night kept me from getting into that accident. But it also led me directly to the snake waiting in the grass. Even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night with the same strange feeling that someone is standing beside the bed. And once in a while, when the house is completely silent, I hear that whisper again, just barely audible near the window, saying my name the same way it did that night. Last week, I noticed something on the outside of the glass that I had never seen before. Smudges in the dust, like fingers had pressed against the window from outside. When I stepped into the yard the next morning, I found the same footprints in the dirt beneath it. Fresh this time, leading from the tree line straight toward the place where I sleep. Which means whatever called me that night did not disappear after the snake struck. It only stepped back into the trees to wait, and sooner or later, it will whisper my name again. If there is one thing these stories prove, it is that not every warning comes in the form you expect. Sometimes it is a phone call, sometimes it is a car horn, and sometimes it is a voice whispering your name in the dark. The only question is, when it happens to you, will you listen, or will it already be too late? If one of these stories stayed with you, Let me know in the comments which warning you would have obeyed: the film, reel the horn in the street, or the whisper in the dark. And if you want more disturbing stories like these, subscribe to Tales of the Darkness and turn on notifications, because next week I have 3 more stories that will make you think twice before answering anything after midnight. Sleep well.